We are starting with the story of housing in New York City. So I thought I'd go back a little bit. If you're old enough, if you're at least 40 years old, you're telling your age if you remember this happening. This was a lot in the South Bronx, and President Carter visited it in '77, and then Reagan went in 1980, claiming that Carter had failed the cities. So this is what was happening in New York in the 60s, 70s, into the 90s, capital flight from New York City, building abandonment. As you can see here, and there was nothing in the lot. The buildings are a shell. So this was New York for quite some time. And that is part of the story of what is happening now that that is over and capital is back in the city, and why capitalism is not the way to provide housing. So this is a community. What is a community land trust? A community land trust is a nonprofit that has power over, has control over the land. There we go.
Governed by community members for the purposes of owning land and maintaining deep affordability. It essentially democratizes the concept of land ownership by getting the broader community involved, not just those who have the money to purchase land. A CLT acquires properties, vacant lots, or buildings, and it keeps the ownership of land. It leases use of the land to property owners that own the structures that sit on top of the land. The property owner enters a 99-year renewal ground lease agreement to lease the land from the CLT. The ground lease includes restrictions governing the affordability of the housing as well as any other restrictions. The community decides what affordable housing actually means because local residents sit on the board of directors of the CLT. The structure of the board is divided into three parts. Community land trusts are not a new model. The current understanding of a CLT model was created by Black farmers and civil rights activists in Georgia. In order to suppress anti-segregation organizing, white landowners would fire and evict Black farmers. To combat that, they formed New Communities INC in 1969 in Albany, Georgia, to advance a comprehensive vision for Black self-determination, economic empowerment, and community safety through collective ownership of land. Currently, there are 277 CLTs across the U.S., and there are 18 emerging and fully established CLTs in NYC. We are one of 2 in Brooklyn. We encourage you to take action now. You can donate by going to our website, eastnewyorkclt.org. You can also follow us on.
Okay, cool. So that's our understanding. Okay, so the issue of community land trust is important when we think about New York City and what it takes to live in New York. So many New Yorkers are rent burdened, and that's defined as spending more than 30% of income on rent. And a large number of people, 42%, are rent burdened. And the average New York City household needs to increase its income by 66% in order to get out of that precarious situation. And we see that the income disparities are largely racial, with Latino families having to increase income by a lot, 140%, more than 100% for Black people, 40% for Asians, and white people have the least amount of rent burden. And this explains why we need to look at this model of providing affordable housing in New York. So here you see a chart, and it shows rent affordability by race in each borough of New York City. So you can see the boroughs here, of the 5 of them, what the median rent is for each one, how much you have to earn to avoid being rent burdened in any of these places, and what that means for white, Black, Asian, and Latino families. And you can see the minimum amount is pretty high. Even in the most affordable borough, Staten Island, you have to make $75,000 in order to pay rent without it being a literal burden on you. So these are community land trusts in the city of New York. They exist in every borough. It makes sense. Staten Island only has 1. It's the smallest by population. And many in Manhattan and the Bronx. It's interesting that there are only 2 each in Brooklyn and Queens, where there is quite a need for the creation of housing that people can afford. This is, so we have to talk about tax lien sales and what this does to communities and why you need a new model. This building is in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. It's pretty typical of the architecture, attached buildings. Excuse me, and this home on the right side was in the last tax lien sale last month in New York. And this might be a single family house. It sometimes is, but you can also see this could be 3 or 4 units as well. It could provide housing for 3 or 4 families. So what are tax lien sales? And this goes back to the slides I showed of what happened when there was capital flight and white flight from New York City. The city took over thousands of properties that it could not maintain. Sometimes the city was a landlord. People still lived in these properties and was the worst landlord. When Rudy Giuliani was mayor, he came up with this plan for the city to get money instead of foreclosing on these properties and trying to take over them. So in 1996, he established these tax lien sales. It sells a property owner's debts, uncollected tax and water debts, to private investors. The last tax lien sale was last month. It was put on hold for a couple of years because of COVID, and resulted in $145 million in city revenue. City gets cash up front, but the interest is very high. And it puts people who are already distressed, obviously they wouldn't be in a tax lien sale if they had money, with high interest rates. And the city has raised more than $1 billion from the 90s until the last figure is from 2015. But what happens is people who can't pay anyway, that's why they're in that predicament, they are immediately inundated with demands from these investors, these people who invest in debt. How predatory is that? And of course, they end up losing their homes, sometimes a single family home, sometimes multi-family. And where are tax liens sold? And this is why I think it's interesting that the boroughs most in need of community land trusts had so few. So high concentrations in Black and Latino neighborhoods. So the shaded areas show you where the population is 50% of color, and you see most of the dots are in those places. So these are people with lower incomes who can't keep up their properties, can't pay their expenses, and the property ends up in a tax lien sale. And this was a tweet from a city council member. Her name's Carlina Rivera. She represents the Lower East Side and part of Chinatown. And the article is "Tax Lien Sales Tick Toward Expiration Date Without an Alternative." So there's discussion about what to do instead of tax lien sales. And she is a big advocate of community land trusts. And she says here very clearly in her tweet, instead of relying on these tax lien sales, which take property, which harm neighborhoods, that the community land trust is an alternative that is working and can work. So how do these tax lien sales hurt tenants, and why do we need a new model? So this is a building in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and the owner lost it in a tax lien sale. The new owner promptly emptied the building, except for one apartment. And it encourages landlords to, sometimes they just stop spending any money on their building and give it up. And they ignore building violations, so people suffer while the building goes through this process. And of course, they suffer if they're evicted. And if the building is of a smaller size, 6 units or fewer, it is not under the regulation of the New York's rent stabilization laws, which protect tenants and determine when someone can be evicted and not. So this is, so the proposal is to turn over buildings to community land trust. And this was a document prepared by the Community Land Trust Initiative, which explains how this could be done. So instead of having the sale of buildings, the properties could be turned over to a community land trust, and they can determine affordability for a building. All right, and there's also something being proposed. This has not gone anywhere in the city council or state legislature yet. It's Copa, Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. And it would require building owners to give notice to the city, and so that nonprofit organizations would have the opportunity to at least make an offer on the building, so that these properties are not just lost to developers who are there to make a profit and not to offer housing that people can afford. So the CLTs are the list that I just showed you on the map. They exist in partnership with city government. And in this last city budget, the current fiscal year, they allocated $1.5 million to support CLTs. And this is not the first time they funded them. And unfortunately, it's not enough money to secure land, but it is a process of tenant organizing, education, and technical and legal support to help get CLTs off the ground. And this is a just a little snippet of someone from the East New York Community Land Trust speaking at a rally at New York City Hall. It's like a minute long.
Margaret, the audio on the videos hasn't been coming through for some of us. Sorry.
Oh, you can't hear it? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that.
We put that in the chat. Some of us put it in the chat, but we probably should have interjected in the last one.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the chat, so I didn't know what you were saying. So let me stop the share and start over. I didn't turn on the sound. Hold up. Sorry about that. Okay, share sound. Here we go. So if you can't hear it, just unmute and tell me so.
Invest in community land trust. What it means to communities such as Brownsville and East New York is everything. There's conversations in East New York about the what if. What if this investment was done 7-10 years ago? What if this investment in true resources was committed on a yearly basis when gentrification really started hitting our communities. The what if have to stop now into action. We need the necessary resources and money. 1.5 billion, but we'll take the 1.5 million for now. I got to just speak things into an existence. This housing justice tool, this economic justice tool, this racial justice tool is so much and very much important in our communities. This tool, if exercised correctly, would at least give our communities a fighting chance against the for-profit developers, against the greedy speculators. It gives the moment of pause to know that you will have to go through community if you decide to own land, and then your form of ownership we see as displacement. So invest the 1.5 billion, that's the future, but for right now we'll take the 1.5 million in the necessary resources to protect our communities, to fight for our communities. Good morning.
All right.
Good morning, everyone. My name is.
Okay. So that gentleman is from East New York. East New York is a neighborhood in Brooklyn called East New York, as it is the easternmost part of the borough. And de Blasio rezoned that and other neighborhoods. Essentially, they were zoned for smaller scale housing, and this rezoning allows for larger scale housing, bigger buildings. And that, of course, means there's speculation. Displacement is incentivized. So, for example, you have this house in East New York. It was funny, the article I found, that people call it gentrification gray. Apparently the gentrified properties all look the same. And this house sold for $420,000 in 2018. And in 2021, again, for $1.2 million. And there are proposals, there's legislation that would disincentivize this speculation and constant flipping by requiring owners to pay additional taxes. So in this particular case, the new owner would have had to pay an additional $150,000 in taxes because it had been flipped so frequently. All right. So this is, now that I know you can hear, I'll show you a minute. East New York Community Land Trust is new. They've only been around for a year. And let them speak for themselves.
I'm gonna be honest, historically, there hasn't been an appetite to see middle class and low income people strive to be anything.
Yesterday, they said that black and brown people couldn't afford or couldn't own their own home, that we weren't responsible. But we, the East New York CLT, are here to make a change. We are here to change their minds.
East New York is the last communities of color that hasn't fully been transformed by gentrification and displacement. Right now, it's the perfect opportunity for us to make our stand and say that there are other ways that our communities get to develop without displacement.
As I stand here and I look at this particular NYPD police parking lot, which is actually owned by HPD, which goal and purpose is to build housing, but right now it's just a parking lot.
We have to change the narrative. There's no way that people who have lived in this community for decades, raised their families here, gone to school here, worked here, cannot afford to own here.
A community land trust is a tool to address housing and economic injustice in our community.
A CLT is a nonprofit organization governed by a board of community residents that treats land as a public good. A CLT acquires and holds land to ensure that it is always used in ways that benefit the local community.
We're really in a time where we're able to shift what housing means, and instead of housing being a commodity, this is our opportunity to create housing as a right.
We are boots on the ground in the community. We have surveyed over 250 lots right here in East New York that are city-owned, which are vacant. We can be using it for housing. We can be using it for public spaces. We can be using it for locally owned business commercial spaces.
East New York CLT are the pride of East New York.
We are East New York CLT.
They are the community, they are the mothers, the fathers, the daughters, the brothers.
East New York CLT is people like me, everyday Jane and John Does, who really want to see their community evolve.
The black and brown people that live in this community are East New York CLT.
I want to say that the CLT is probably the best of the best that this neighborhood has to offer people.
To me, it has meant friendship, unity.
More than affordable, it's sustainable.
Ownership,
Stability.
unlimited generational wealth.
Because it's a new venture, it's a revolution in the way that we look at affordable ownership.
We are stronger, united. And if you want to be a part of a dynamic team to help further that cause along, the East New York Community Land Trust is where it's at.
And you see, they're asking for donations there. They need money to in order to operate, in order to get the properties that they need in order to operate. But CLTs are not just about housing. This group in the Bronx has a green space plan, and I'll play like a minute of it. And this was a presentation to the New York City Council.
And then through asset mapping, we also identified the need for green space. We have some of the least quantity of green space per capita in the entire city, in this community. Encircled by one of the largest significant maritime industrial areas with no access to the peninsula that surrounds our city, our community. For about 60,000 residents have no access to the peninsula. So through asset mapping, we also identified underutilized publicly owned spaces. Just like the Heart Center, the Lincoln Recovery Center was publicly owned, but not really being used to the benefit of the community, which is shouldering a great deal of the city's burden for waste, for fossil power plants, peaker stations, and heavy diesel truck intensive businesses, and also we're encircled by highways. So instead of expecting to come from the top down, we thought we create our change from the ground up. And we use this community land trust model as a way of stewarding the land and also creating a way to move forward with healthier outcomes. So in 2014, we had our waterfront plan prioritized as a state priority project. And now we're working to activate this waterfront plan to create this green space for recreational purposes, but also for climate change and flood mitigation. So we're building out.
All right. So here's a success story in East Harlem, El Barrio. The East Harlem El Barrio Community Land Trust has actually been able to acquire these buildings and provide housing. But it's happened because of a partnership with the city of New York. HPD came in with money for them. The city can make funds available for developers or just turn over property to them, but this cannot work without the help from city agencies. So HPD came in with cash to help East Harlem El Barrio develop these properties, tax subsidies, a capital grant. They helped them with the legal process that made this real in this neighborhood. So the CLT board determined what affordability is. They reserved a certain number of apartments for community residents who had been unhoused. And it's important to have nonprofit groups determining what affordability means. One of the problems we have in New York is the city will turn over property to developers, and they have to provide a certain number of units to low income or moderate income people. But then when you see the guidelines, it's usually more money than people in that neighborhood actually earn. That is because the federal government, HUD, HUD determines income guidelines based on an entire region. So not only, in this case, East Harlem, they would say they would include the region. They would include all of Manhattan. They would include Westchester County, a suburb, where the incomes are much higher, and then determine what is affordable and what is not based upon these this faulty information. And that creates a big problem where supposedly affordable housing development projects aren't really affordable at all. And that's why it's important to have, for the community to have this structure, to have a seat at the table. They're the ones who know what's affordable for their neighborhood and what is not. So, you know, I started off this morning talking about the principles of green eco-socialism. And I think the community land trusts fit the description perfectly. We have social ownership, not state ownership, geared to human needs, a democratic process, and not a top-down process, and decision-making guided by the need to maintain and restore the health of the natural ecosystem. And as we saw in the Bronx, that is a part of what community land trusts do. But so we see that they exist because of the support of elected officials, but it is not enough. The city and the state need to step up more and help these CLTs to make to really be able to get their hands on properties and to have more successful projects like the one that that we saw in East Harlem. And now that I know you missed some of what was being said, I think it's explained, but I'm going to go back to that first slide I was trying to show that had sound. And we'll go back. Oh, here we go.
A community land trust, or CLT, is a nonprofit organization governed by community members for the purposes of owning land and maintaining deep affordability. It essentially democratizes the concept of land ownership by getting the broader community involved, not just those who have the money to purchase land. A CLT acquires properties, vacant lots, or buildings, and it keeps the ownership of land. It leases use of the land to property owners that own the structures that sit on top of the land. The property owner enters a 99-year renewal ground lease agreement to lease the land from the CLT. The ground lease includes restrictions governing the affordability of the housing as well as any other restrictions. The community decides what affordable housing actually means because local residents sit on the board of directors of the CLT. The structure of the board is divided into 3 parts. Community land trusts are not a new model. The current understanding of a CLT model was created by Black farmers and civil rights activists in Georgia. In order to suppress anti-segregation organizing, white landowners would fire and evict Black farmers. To combat that, they formed New Communities INC in 1969 in Albany, Georgia, to advance a comprehensive vision for Black self-determination, economic empowerment, and community safety through collective ownership of land. Currently, there are 277 CLTs across the U.S., and there are 18 emerging and fully established CLTs in NYC. We are one of 2 in Brooklyn. We encourage you to take action now. You can donate by going to our website, eastnewyorkclt.org. You can also follow us on.
Okay, cool. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation. I thought we would have time to talk or answer questions. So I'm opening the floor. Someone put in a post regarding community land cooperatives. hold up, let me just do it this way. So so Steve Welser put this in. Are you still there, Steve? No. Okay, so that's all we have here. So thank you for this.
I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, great. So can you tell us about what the links you put in here?
Yes. If you get a chance to read those two articles, they're short articles in Shelter Force magazine, and they explain how historically the CLTs unfortunately have tended to become managed by their boards. And there's a new concept. The concept is that it's called a community land cooperative. It's a movement that's just starting. It's just more autonomous, more it's more in the way of being self-funded, self-managed, and therefore more democratic than CLTs. CLTs are great. And until this new movement called CLCs, which are cooperatives, gets going, CLTs are great. But everyone who's a green social activist should consider the next level up of social change associated with these kind of formations. So I just urge you to read those two articles in Shelter Force about community land cooperatives.
Thank you very much. So we have on stack Nassim and then Gloria.
Thank you so much. I posted my question in the chat with respect to time, just looking for a resource or a directory of a listing of all CLTs, if anybody has one.
Okay, I'm sure there is. I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to find because there are almost 300 of them across the country. So I'm sure that it's something that could be found without much difficulty. Thank you, Nassim. Gloria.
Thanks, Margaret. As someone who also lives in New York City, this was really enlightening. I didn't even know how many community land trusts we had. Of course, I know the long history of kind of building towards that. And so just to point out, when you talked about how they do this kind of quote affordable, and why we can't have the government or involved in that, and on the federal level, and certainly influences by the lobbyists of the real estate developers, is that just recently in Brooklyn, where I live, they're advertising a lottery for affordable housing. Not quite sure the area, somewhere around Willoughby, so maybe downtown Brooklyn, but it's starting. They give you the median. The median income of Brooklyn is $31,000. $31,000 hasn't changed. In fact, it's gone down in the last. And the starting income level for the affordable housing is $86,000, going up to over $100,000. And I could just think of people who say, well, here's my chance to get in this lottery, and it's just not even what needs to be done. And certainly it's not the right the right approach, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, it's this is something that was a mystery to me until recently, that HUD has this system which excludes people with this regional approach. So Brooklyn, they would include incomes from Long Island, from Nassau County, and in this region, and say, well, this is the median income, but not for that neighborhood. And so it becomes a scam. And the city and the state are helping developers scam. And they're helping them to keep properties in the hands of people with a lot of money, to make sure these developments are only for high income individuals. And there seems to be no shortage of them. I don't know if people are coming from, well, actually people are coming from other places to New York, Europeans, people from around the country coming here. A lot of absentee ownership of, that's another story. I don't want to get too far off on that tangent, but those are the things which make affordable housing so scarce for working people in the cities. And COVID has had an impact on housing as well, where the neighborhoods that are most impacted by COVID are becoming also the least affordable. And we saw it some in that map of where there's tax lien sales. And those are places where people, it makes sense, where people are more likely to live in multifamily housing. So how do you keep yourself safe from an infectious disease if you live with other people? It's very difficult, if not completely impossible. So, and those are the places where rents are going up. In higher income neighborhoods in New York, a lot of people left. They went, upstate, or they went to Florida, they went somewhere else to ride out the storm, so to speak. And people who already were living on the edge are in an even worse situation. And I just wanted to add, the issue with the tax lien sales is not yet resolved. The city gets money, so they don't want to end it. But the process hurts people. It hurts tenants. It hurts the owners who are already in distress and end up in that situation in the first place. So the new mayor, Eric Adams, has said, and the new city council speaker have said they want to get rid of tax lien sales, but they haven't said what's going to replace it, what the city is going to do next. Yes, Nasim.
Sorry, that was my old hand.
Oh, you just never took it down. So, so this is the issue for New York City, and I want to say that it's good to know that there are a lot of elected officials who are supportive of these efforts, because the real estate lobby they are the big funder in New York City politics. The new mayor, Eric Adams, got a lot of money from developers. So that means they're going to be the ones who have access. It's not going to be the people who really need the city's help, who really need the government to step in. And because this is what government has always done. And, this austerity that starts in Washington trickles down. You talk about trickle-down economics, starting with Reagan, when we were told that, government was bad, and every president since then has cut and cut and cut what the amount of money that's used for public housing. And Democrats do the same thing that Republicans do. So HUD, the federal agency, is the one most responsible for building public housing. All the housing developments in New York and other cities, those are all built with federal money. So when that money disappears, there is nothing to replace it with. The city now is turning over management of some housing authority buildings to private companies. But that's not the answer. It's something that the government should be doing. And now we see it in housing authority developments not being maintained. People who don't have heat. There used to be a joke about the projects that they were too hot. Now there are people who don't have any heat, who go months without their repairs being resolved, if ever. And that's all because of governmental austerity. And that is something that we must campaign for. But anyway, so that's what we need. We need government input. This is the CLTs are a way for people to determine what happens in their communities, but they need government resources in order to be able to do it. To sum up.